Protagonists! You can have one of them, you can have two of them, three, I don't care. The thing about protagonists is they're very, very important. Why are they very, very important? Is it because they're compelling? A bit, I guess. Because they're imperfect, and in fiction, if you're imperfect, you have to be destroyed or redeemed, and as imperfect people ourselves, we are watching to find out whether we're destined for the scrap heap or salvation. I know, I'm not your fucking therapist, man. Creating premise with character. We've established a world is a set of rules that gives rise to the situations of drama. What I add to that now is when we add a character to that place with a little thought, we are delivered back a tidy premise. Simple cause and effect. If it's a world of twigs and your character's a match, you do the rest of the arithmetic in your head. A premise carries an unspoken promise of potential. A boy adopts a fugitive alien on the run from the authorities. A forest nymph gets a job at an aggressive logging company. An old man in a nursing home decides to relive his life backwards in order to de-age himself to reverse the aging process. Premise carries an unspoken story. So, for example, in that last one, we know that aging doesn't work like that. We know that you can't just relive events backwards and expect to de-age. And we assume that the people who live in that fictional world also know that. So we're expecting friction, farce, and just maybe the secret of eternal youth. Stories. My point is, the premise doesn't outright state what's going to happen. It just carries the seeds, the potential of the show. And while worlds and characters and sensibilities are what keep a show going, what sells it is a juicy premise. Personally, I think it's unfair that a premise is what gets a show going, because so many great shows don't have an interesting premise. Really, it's just the accuracy in which those stories are told, the humanity of them. But what do I know? Next, story doesn't equal character plus world. If you already have thought of a premise and you've got a world in mind, you can calculate character from that. Likewise, if you've got a premise and you've got a character in mind, you can just about extrapolate what world you're going to need to have. And in that situation, I would say, okay, I've got world and I've got premise. Who best to throw into that situation to draw out its potential and its impurities? But these, in my experience, tend to lead to weak characters and weak worlds. Because once premise is achieved, it's very easy to look at the thing and think, oh yeah, and it's in space, or oh yeah, and it's a plucky FBI agent. We tend to draw straight lines when we're starting out. And really, starting with character and world can lead to weak premise. It's just that we have such a wider frame of reference for world and character than we do for premise. So we live in a world, we have a long history, we are surrounded by characters and interesting people who live with us, who entertain us. Premise is just a bit more removed. A premise that has the potential for a story that can outpace the modern viewer, engorged on centuries of fiction and with an outrageously overdeveloped sense of foreshadowing. It's more difficult. Ergo, for this theoretical project of yours, we're starting with world, we're adding character, and then we're taking premise from the two of them. So, to recap, world gives location and a place that ideas can spring from. Character catalyzes those ideas and gives us actions in order to move through the world. And plot is the natural sequence of events that follow from placing that character in that world. Straightforward. Nothing you don't know already, probably. Last video, I touched on the notion that a show can be character-driven. This doesn't mean that the show's best element is its character. More that the show's growth is character growth. That's the vector the story follows. Shows aren't necessarily driven by one element in any case, but here are some examples. World-driven shows are rare because world and universe seldom drive story, but we do see it kind of in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Premise-driven shows include procedural dramas like cop shows or hospital dramas, and monster of the week concepts. Style-driven shows are largely driven by the sensibility, the style with which they are made. You'll find it in the works of Bill Wirtz, of Joe Pera, of Don Hertzfeld, and sketch shows often fall into that category as well. In my opinion, the best show is a mix of all the above. Okay, so take it, Rick and Morty. What's Rick and Morty driven by? Is it the world? Yeah. Is it the characters? Yes, also. Is it style? Is it sensibility? Yeah, absolutely. Rick and Morty is a very style, sensibility, and directorially driven show. Okay, so consider that the dialogue is so tight together. There's no gaps between lines of dialogue, and so it's really fast paced. You get a really high amount of jokes per minute, and you feel spoiled as a viewer. And as a result of that, any gap you leave after someone's bit of dialogue that isn't a transition between things, any gap that you leave after somebody said something has emotional weight. And it doesn't really matter how much of a gap you put in there, there's still going to be read as emotional weight because we unconsciously absorb the fact that there's never gaps between the dialogue. It's very, very clever, very efficient, and very effective. Also, Rick and Morty has a semi-improvised style of dialogue. When you see a show like Whose Line Is It Anyway?, we glean that it's a lot funnier than it actually is because we know the circumstances of it, that they have just thought of it, it's just come out of their head. There's this miraculous element. And when you make a show with semi-improvised dialogue, it carries a bit of that miracle. I know I talk about Rick and Morty a lot. I'm going to keep talking about Rick and Morty a lot. It does a lot of things right. It gets a lot of shit. Fucking no, it's really good. In terms of how I actually do things, I like to start with personality before anything else. And then I go through my ideas and I'll pull out world and I'll pull out a premise that I've thought of that might fit. Usually, as I'm thinking of these things, they will become connected to one another. Oh yeah, that would fit there, that would fit there. And the skill, I suppose, if you can call it skill, is in picking what worlds go with what character, what premise go with what worlds, etc. My final point as regards characters and premise, and I'll go into this in later videos, is that stories are symmetrical. You start in the light, you go to the dark, and then you come back to the light having brought something back from the dark. This is true of characters also. It's good practice for them to contain, hard-coded into their personality, the seeds of their own downfall or redemption. In The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Kimmy Schmidt's irrepressible peppiness kept her sane for 15 years in the bunker of a maniac. The show poses the question, can the high-stakes dramas of modern New York offer any new stresses for Kimmy? The answer is no. In fact, she happens to New York. Every person she meets, she has moral lessons for. She is a font of wisdom, wisdom through suffering. It's a really dark show, actually. James T. Kirk of the original Star Trek, as a child, was on a colony presided over by this person who was watching his people starve. They were due a delivery of supplies. It wasn't going to come until much later. He saw his population starving and decided to kill one half of the population. Just then, the supplies arrived early. And as a result, we get a character who, despite any hopeless situation, never gives up. And that initial hard coding carries the seeds of future salvation. BoJack Horseman was denied a happy childhood. Now, in his 50s, having tragically internalized that he's not worthy of love, and also ironically being adored by pop culture, he mindlessly seeks to fix the past with the present. Tragically, the primary obstacle between the love he craves and the healing that he needs is time. He's trying to feed a closed mouth. The chance for a beloved, cherished childhood is over. His childhood's gone. His mother's dead. But he's entitled, so he'll keep trying, he'll get more desperate, more volatile, until inevitably the depths of his brokenness will become exposed. And as a result, inevitably he'll be rejected from the place that's enabling him, Hollywood, which is what he needs to heal. He carries the seeds of his salvation with him. We aren't necessarily predicting everything the protagonist is going to do at this stage. A well-built protagonist, like a well-built world, should have drama organically arising from them. And it's not necessarily obvious specifically what kind of drama that will be just yet. There's a whole other stage for that, when we look at the logical steps your character will take through the world when confronted by it. So, to recap, when starting out, let your world and character or characters lead to your premise. The premise is an unspoken promise of potential. Let your show be driven by many aspects, not just character. Their personality will be hard-coded with the seed of their downfall or salvation. Next video, we're going to be doing what you probably thought this video would be doing, designing your character. As usual, if you go to Patreon, you can see that video a week early, but otherwise, I'll just see you in a week.